Hello, writers. Please welcome cartoonist Matt Madden, author of 99 Ways to Tell a Story, who joins the Write Anyway Summit to tell us about the power of constraints and limitations to drive innovation in our creative work.
Hi, my name is Matt Madden. I'm a cartoonist and an educator and a coach, and I want to talk to you today about constraints or limitations, restrictions. These are words that tend to have negative connotations, but I want to show you how they can be used as a force for focusing your creativity and even pushing you into new directions of innovation and exploration in your work. So I want to talk about two different aspects of constraints that are related but crucially different. I want to talk about everyday constraints and what I'll call creative constraints. Whatever domain you're working in, it's important to be aware of the limitations and parameters that are pre-existing in whatever your current activity is, whether that's writing copy or creating a work of art. One problem we all share is the challenge of the blank page, the blank screen, the blank canvas, right? We've all had that terror and feeling of anxiety of staring at a blank sheet and planning to write something or draw something and not knowing where to start and what to do. And even at that basic level, I would argue that it can help to think about even the shape and size of whatever that blank medium is. So if it's a sheet of paper, it's probably rectangular, it's probably a certain size and a certain ratio, and that can start helping you think about how this picture frame might be like a window that you're filling out. If you're writing, it can be helpful to think about the final format that people are going to be reading. So is it going to be for a screen or a printed format? Is it something that's going to have to fit in a very specific, window of a smartphone or of a box within a larger graphic? Or if you're writing for a particular platform, like I have a Substack, and when I get beyond a certain point in my posts, I get a little warning saying, you have now exceeded the email limit of what's going to show up in a single email. And that's a constraint that I have not yet mastered. I tend to go past that limit. But it's helpful to have that kind of boxed in sense because it helps you to focus your thinking and your writing and your drawing or whatever it is that you're doing. These kinds of limitations, even at a basic level, can be freeing and help you focus in your work. So whatever your medium or domain or technology is really helpful, and I would say crucial, to understand what those pre-existing parameters and limitations are to stop you from going down rabbit holes or painting yourself into a corner. So for example, I'm a cartoonist. So at a basic level, I'm telling stories using words and images on a series of rectangular sheets of paper. I already talked about the blank page, but I figured out as a cartoonist early on that it's never really a blank page because there's always a box that's going to contain the drawings. And if you think of a comic strip or a comic page, you're probably going to imagine little boxes of panels arranged in some kind of grid on the page. And for me, when I realized that even if I didn't know what I was going to draw yet, I could take a blank sheet of paper, I could draw a rectangular box, and then I could divide that into, say, 9 panels, or it could be 6 panels or 24 panels. Already I would have a sense of, okay, there's a certain amount of space on this page. There's a certain rhythm implied by these panels. I might change it later on, but it gives me a starting point. And becoming aware of that fundamental metronome-like visual rhythm of comics was a crucial step in me learning how to tell stories visually. Comics also has a lot of material constraints that come along with it, right? Up until 15 years ago, the vast majority of comics were drawn on paper using black India ink, using a number of different tools, whether it's pens or brushes, different kinds of technical pens, for example. And up until maybe 20 years ago, the majority of comics were printed on really cheap paper, often newsprint paper and often in newspapers. So that required that the art be very simple and the colors be very flat and easy to scan by the eye so that even if something was printed all smudgy and the colors were out of register, it would still be legible. So when you think about, and even if you're not a comics fan, if you just kind of flash on the idea of comic books, I'm sure you have this idea of bold black lines and dynamic shapes and flat, bright colors, but often very coarse, right? You can see the dots. And so that style was not a aesthetic decision. It came out of the fact that the printing was so coarse that was a solution that artists had to come up with early on. For example, H.G. Peter was the artist on the early Wonder Woman comics, and his art has this wonderful woodcut quality, but he developed that style specifically so that it would reproduce well on the technology that was given. If you can see that he actually had a much more delicate drawing style where he would use cross-hatching and very fine lines in other media. But for comic books on newsprint, mass-produced, he had to develop this very simple style along with many other artists of that era. And that has now become an aesthetic style that people choose to draw in, even when they're working digitally and can do whatever they want, because it's become codified and associated with comic books. But at the origin, it really came out of necessity and out of the limitations of printing and the materials that were available at the time. Another important aspect of the history of comic books is that for many aspects of the industry, these are serialized stories that are printed out on a regular clip. You think about daily comic strips, weekly comic books, monthly titles that come out, giant weekly manga collections in Japan that are often hundreds of pages long. So the deadline is another major aspect of the creative output as well as the commercial output of comics. And again, it's another kind of limitation that we have a negative association with, and no one really, I think, gets pleasure out of being given the deadline. But I think we all have to acknowledge that having that deadline imposed on us can actually be something very useful. For example, here's this quote from Duke Ellington saying, "I don't need time. What I need is a deadline," right? So think about your domain of work for a moment and maybe make a list of what are these pre-existing constraints and conditions that define your work that you really have no choice to get around. What are the formats, the space considerations, the kinds of materials you might use in your work? What are the deadlines built into what you do? Whether that's thinking about screen size, or if you're doing, video work, like what are the various cropping formats for TikTok videos or Instagram Reels and so on. Just being aware of all of these limitations and parameters can help clear the decks in a lot of ways, and maybe not give you your final solution. You still have that little blank format, but at least it's a rectangular blank format, and it can only be 35 seconds long or whatever the rules are of the day. So I mentioned there's two types of constraints I want to talk about. We've been talking about the everyday constraints, right? The pre-existing built-in parameters and limitations of any medium or creative endeavor. But I want to propose to you another kind of constraint, what I'm calling a creative constraint, which is an additional constraint that you add on yourself to your work. Sounds kind of nutty, I know, but I think it can lead to really amazing results. So let me give an example from my own work of what I mean by a creative constraint. I was asked to do an illustration back in 2012 for a magazine from Colgate University. And it was an article about the history of American comic books. And so it came with the deadline, all of these pre-existing format constraints. They gave me a size. It was pretty big. It was about a half a page or maybe a third of a page, horizontal layout. They gave me a deadline. I had to give them sketches within a week and then final art, a few days after that or whatever. So that was, enough to get me started. And it was actually the art directors themselves that gave me an additional idea, which was why not try to make the illustration itself a comic, since it's about the history of comic books. And that was a really great aha moment, because not only did I have the deadline and the basic format, now since I was making comics, I knew I could use my grid, and that would help me think more clearly about storytelling. So I arbitrarily just divided my image area into 6 panels and started to think about, all right, well, now that helps me think about rhythm, but I'm trying to express everything from the original appearance of Superman up until the graphic novel era of the early 2000s. And what I needed was an additional rule. I needed to make it more difficult to myself. So I told myself, what if each panel has the exact same composition, so that I have to figure out a way to take these very static images that repeat and tell the history of comics through those images. In some sense, that made it even harder because there was no story to tell. There was no movement from one panel to the next. But what I quickly realized, and I think why the idea occurred to me, was that I could make little changes to each panel. And through that, through changing the costume, through changing the backgrounds, through changing the dialogue balloon in each panel, I was able to kind of go through my book collection and think about, all right, what are 6 key moments from the history of American comic books that I can express in 6 panels that will have a kind of chronological sequence that will give you some idea of how comics have developed in America in book form over, 100 years or so. And I was pretty pleased with the results. It became my most shared image on social media. And it really came out of that, the combination of both kinds of constraints, really having the deadline. This is not a comic I was planning to do, on my own, but it was that extra constraint that I gave myself of making these repeating shapes in each panels that really brought it to the next level. Let me give you another example from pop culture, one that's been in the news a fair amount, and maybe some of you have seen it or read about it. It's a Netflix miniseries called Adolescence, made in the UK, and deals with a very intense topic of a teenage boy who's accused of murdering a girl and how that plays out across the whole community that he lives in. And it's told over 4 episodes that are an hour long. So already again, we're talking about the built-in parameters. Just imagine the number of limitations and constraints that go into making a TV series. You've got to, wrangle the script, the whole crew. You have to get the locations. You're working on a very tight schedule and you have a specific budget you have to meet. Stephen Graham, the lead actor and the creator of the series, however, to make things even more insane, he had this idea to make each 1-hour episode, 50-minute episode, with a single camera shot. So there's a single camera that's moving, that's turned on at the beginning of the episode and runs through the entire episode. And these are not shot in a single room. This involves hundreds of people, the camera moving across town, getting in a car, going from a house to the police station. At one point, pretty famously now, the camera floats up into the sky and crosses the neighborhood and then lands in a parking lot on the other side of the neighborhood, which was done with about 5 camera operators attaching it to a drone and then taking it off when it came back down. It's a remarkable achievement in film storytelling. And the reason it's a great example, I think, of both kinds of constraints is that the fact of filming each episode in a single camera shot, far from being just like a gimmick, and it did help promote the show and bring it a lot of attention, it raised the intensity and the you are there feeling to just an almost unbearable degree. It's an incredibly intense show to watch because it's unrelenting. There's no break. There's no cuts. There's no blackouts where you get a break. And the origin of this series was that Stephen Graham was learning about violence among boys against girls in the UK, being tied up with the incel movement and toxic masculinity and internet culture. And so it was something he really urgently wanted to talk about. And of course, that kind of storytelling runs the risk of becoming an after-school special and being something very didactic. So by uniting it with this very ambitious, creative constraint in the way that he told his story, he raised the storytelling to a level of artfulness that both made it riveting storytelling and also served to really popularize the ideas he was trying to explore in that series. In my teaching and coaching, I've been able to really observe students make great strides when I confront them with these weird ideas of using constraints. For example, I had a student named Lisa Frubeis. She's German, and she was taking an online course with me using constraints. She had been given an assignment for the summer to do a weekly comic for a major German newspaper for their Sunday magazine. And it was your classic, blank page crisis. She didn't really know what to do. She just had this space. She had it for the summer. That's all she knew. Hadn't even been making comics all that long. So we tried doing a lot of experiments in this class we were doing together. And at one point I had her do a comics haiku. In other words, to make a comic strip, which is the format she was going to be working in, that would have 3 panels, and the text would be a haiku. So 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, if you're familiar with that famous Japanese form. And also to try and make the visuals very simple and minimalist, to kind of evoke a kind of visual haiku. And that really clicked with her. She took that home and she played around with it. And pretty soon it kind of sparked all these other ideas, the limitation and the playfulness of, okay, let's not think about this as an assignment, but as a visual poem that I'm going to make. Pretty soon she came back to me and she's like, okay, this is great. I'm going to do each strip every week is going to be structured like a haiku. So it's going to have 3 panels. The words will be haiku in their syllable structure. I've also decided that there's going to be a different color scheme each time I think it's 2 colors each time, which change from week to week. Also, each of the 3 panels will have different visual reference points. One will refer to something happening in the news, because it was a newspaper. The other was going to be referring what I had for breakfast that day, because it was like the Sunday morning paper. And I forget the third one. So she really realized that the more rules and restrictions she put on it, the more productive she became. And that ended up being a very successful run of comic strips for her. And I won't take full credit for her, ongoing success, but after that, it kind of unlocked a lot of things for her. And she pretty soon was designing art for a wraparound decal on a giant tram in a town in Germany to commemorate women's history. So I want you to think about constraints as a game. Becoming aware of pre-existing constraints and parameters will help you to focus and to be aware of what you can and can't do in your work. So thanks for joining me today. If you take anything away from this talk, I hope it's to be more sensitive to the pre-existing limitations and rules that are unavoidable in whatever your creative or business domain is, and to learn how to make those a source of strength instead of something you're just trying to, wish away. But I also really encourage you to think about how those same kinds of constraints and adding new game-like constraints can be a spark for innovation and new ideas that will push your creativity to new levels and surprise your readers as well as yourself.
You'll find Matt's book, 99 Ways to Tell a Story, wherever you get your books, and you'll find Matt online at mattmadden.com.